Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to a special edition of APTN National News. All this week we will bring you perspectives on child welfare. Tonight we look back on some of the looming issues. The Assembly of First Nations held a National Day of Action in Ottawa in November. The annual day is meant to shed more light on the number of First Nations kids in care. APTN's Annette Francis has more.
Under the shelter of umbrellas, about 100 people gathered on Parliament Hill. The Day of Action started with the drum song. Among the crowd is Deputy Grand Chief Betty Ann Anchipanscum, along with 21 youth from the Anishinaabe Nation. She says it's important to support this day and to continue to call out to the federal government to end the inequalities for First Nations kids. She questions why the Government of Canada continues to resist the tribunal's compliance orders.
Our children who have been discriminated and are prejudiced by the present policies, whether they're federal or provincial, continue to live in poverty and have less opportunities than any child in Canada, and that has to be addressed.
Standing among the group is a Minister of Indigenous Services, Jane Philpott. She says since her party took over 20,000 Jordan's principals cases have been approved.
If you know of a child that's not getting the care they need, then you reach out and let us know. We're going to make sure they get the care that they need, and there will be no jurisdictional wrangling. There will be justice for kids.
Carolyn Bennett, the Minister of Crown Relations, agrees there's work to do.
We want to work together, as Minister Philpott said. We hope that the next time that we come together, that it is about that we are on the way to dismantling the child welfare industry. We need to build a system that is based on the rights and well-being of Indigenous children and youth.
Later at a press conference, National Chief Perry Bellegarde says there's been movement, but it hasn't been fast enough.
We see the investments in last year's federal budget and the years before. A lot of it's back-ended. So we have another federal budget coming up now. We have a new minister, Minister Philpott, in terms of services and programs. What can be done now to address this clear need?
Minister Philpott has called for an emergency meeting with the provinces and territories to address the ongoing First Nations child welfare issues, something the National Chief says he supports. That meeting will take place in the new year. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
There was a lot going on leading up to that emergency meeting in January. We'll have more on that later, but first we go to Manitoba, where child apprehension rates are the highest in the country. As Brittany Hobson shows us, one woman is going to great lengths to protect her unborn child.
In Manitoba, it is estimated a newborn child is apprehended every day. The situation has become so dire, this expectant mother has decided to give birth in secret.
I'm feeling like I have to protect this birth from people who have the potential to sever my bond with my child.
The mother cannot be identified because her teenage daughter is currently a ward of the province. 2 years ago, she gave birth to another child in hospital. She says at the time she was forced to fill out paperwork detailing her involvement with Child and Family Services. She now worries her prior involvement will serve as a red flag.
Now I'm sitting here 2 years later and I'm going to have another baby, and I don't want to be in that building when that happens because I'm afraid they're not going to let me leave with him.
First Nations family advocate Cora Morgan isn't surprised to hear of this woman's plan.
We hear it every day because, Manitoba has the highest rate of newborn apprehension in all of Canada.
According to the province, there are approximately 11,000 kids in care, with 90% of those being Indigenous. These numbers will be the focus of an emergency 2-day meeting in Ottawa next week with Minister of Indigenous Services Jane Philpott. The minister will hear from Indigenous leaders, provincial and territorial ministers, and advocates. Morgan says she hopes to see some significant changes to the welfare system after next week's meeting.
After 150 years of the theft of our children, that, there's a meaningful commitment to, First Nations asserting jurisdiction over children and families, that we have opportunities and resources to be able to do prevention at the community level outside of the current system.
The Manitoba government has recently implemented a reform on the child welfare system.
We've got a big problem. That's why we're taking it on head on as a government.
The new reform will see incentives for foster parents who wish to become permanent guardians, but for this mom, more needs to be done.
I think these changes are going to impact how the system operates and how foster families operate. And that's not enough.
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
In October, Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister announced Manitoba's Child and Family Services system would undergo a complete overhaul. To help with that, the province created a committee of community experts to review the current child welfare legislation. Here again is Brittany Hobson.
The Manitoba government has enlisted a new committee to help reduce the staggering number of kids in care. The 7-person committee will work with various groups to review the 2 current child welfare policies in place. According to the province, it's been about 15 years since the acts have been reviewed. Committee member and local activist Michael Redhead Champagne says tackling the system won't be easy.
I see many barriers to where we want our families and our communities to ultimately be. It's actually an extremely daunting task.
Manitoba has made headlines for what some call a crisis when it comes to child welfare. There are about 11,000 kids in care, with 90% of them being Indigenous. In October, the province announced a complete overhaul to the child welfare system. Part of the plan includes a community-based prevention model, which would see more involvement from grassroots organizations.
Providing a bit more flexibility to agencies that deliver the services on behalf of the government, and that will allow them to invest, make further investments in early intervention and prevention.
The committee includes representatives from 3 major Indigenous groups: the Southern Chiefs Organization, Manitoba Kiiwetinoong Okanagan, and the Manitoba Métis Federation. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs has previously criticized the overhaul for not being Indigenous-led. Champagne says the government must take a step back from the process and let advocates share their expertise.
And what we really need is people that are affected by child and family services and people that have an understanding of what needs to change to come forward and help us as a committee to identify what those specific legislative changes are so that we can put together a report that is not going to sit on a shelf.
The committee is supposed to report back in early spring with recommendations on how to improve the child welfare system. Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
When we come back, we'll show you what unfolded at that 2-day emergency meeting on child welfare. Stay with us. Welcome back. The ongoing child welfare crisis was the focus of a 2-day so-called emergency meeting in Ottawa last month. Hundreds of people gathered to come up with ways to reverse the high rates of apprehensions and the overrepresentation of Indigenous kids in care. I was in Ottawa covering that meeting, and not everyone was convinced the conference is going to solve the problems. The goal of dramatically reducing the number of Indigenous youth in the child welfare system is not new, nor are meetings like this to address the crisis.
We know that many parents and grandparents, advocates and frontline workers have used many desperate words over the years to describe the situation facing the children. Since the 1970s, countless Indian child welfare task forces have been convened and reports have been written, but still we're here.
Many of the reasons for the overrepresentation are well known: a lack of proper housing, intergenerational trauma, and poverty.
We have a basic median income gap of approximately $70,000 in our communities. So then it is no wonder that virtually all of the children in care within Inuit Nunangat are Inuit.
There has been some criticism that this is just another meeting, but some here are feeling optimistic this time around, in part because they believe the various levels of government are now listening.
It's not like we don't know what's wrong and we don't know what to fix it and we don't know how to do it and we need hand-holding. I think that people have a misconception and a stereotype about who we are as an Indigenous community. We have been caring for our families pre-contact.
The federal government has a 6-point plan of action that includes shifting the focus from apprehension to prevention and trying to keep children connected to their families and culture. but don't expect an improved child welfare system by the time this conference comes to an end.
It's taken us generations to get to this system. You heard people talking about these kinds of meetings having taken place way back into the 1970s, but the political will is here.
Minister Philpott says an unspecified amount of money will be in the next budget. Not good enough, says the federal NDP, who say there is already a $155 million a year gap.
The federal government will pay when children are put into foster care, when they're taken from their children, taken from their families, but they will not put the funds on the ground in the communities. The Manitoba report talks about this turning children into commodities. I mean, this has been the story of Canada.
The emergency meeting comes to an end on Friday, which is the second anniversary of the landmark ruling by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which agreed Canada was discriminating against First Nations children. Marks 2 years since the tribunal ordered the Government of Canada to end that inequality. Dennis Ward, APTN National News, Ottawa. On day 2, government officials were happy with the outcomes, but not everyone went home feeling changes will come.
The commodification of our children and our families needs to stop.
Jocelyn Wabano-Iatale was leery coming into the 2-day conference on child welfare, and she's not heading home feeling much better.
Because I know that the Millennium Scoop is ongoing, and because I know that our children who fall under the Jordan's Principle are still falling through the cracks, the promises that have been made are not being followed through.
Wabano-Iatale also feels grassroots people were left out of the gathering.
That's quite a disappointment, because I am well aware of the fact that there were many who wanted to attend. This was very secret, is what it seemed to many of us. And they weren't even given an ample opportunity to attend. As well, a lot of our youth were not permitted to attend.
But those who did take part and pulled the meeting together are optimistic about what was discussed. Plans to address root causes and early prevention. Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott says work will get underway on community-based solutions.
Said, of course, the safety of those children is critical. But children can be safe with their aunt. They can be safe with their grandma. They can be safe in community, in a program of kinship care. So let's not use safety as an excuse to extract children from their culture.
Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Carolyn Bennett hopes that after this meeting, agencies will ask if there is anything else that can be done other than apprehending the child. Bennett says there should be no more apprehensions because there are not enough bedrooms.
So let's just be real about the racism and discrimination that is going on in these decisions that are being taken, and it just has to stop.
First Nations child advocate Cindy Blackstock says there were some good conversations over the last 2 days, but adds there's been good conversations over the last 50 years. The federal government was ordered to end inequality for First Nations children 2 years ago today, and not in the next budget.
I've been hopeful many, many times, and I'm hopeful again, but I'll be even more hopeful when I see little kids' lives getting better. That's my measure of success. It always will be.
Dennis Ward, APTN National News, Ottawa. After the break, an Enoch boy from Nunavut and his journey in group homes in the South. Welcome back. Every year, dozens of kids from Nunavut are sent southward. Many end up in Ottawa, put into group homes. Here with the journey of one such child is Kenneth Jackson.
This little Inuk boy doesn't know it, but he's big business. A moneymaker. Group homes make millions every year, housing dozens of Inuit kids just like him. They're wards of the state, not of Ontario, but Nunavut, a territory that can't care for them. So they mainly get shipped to Ottawa. Some stay here years, like this woman's brother.
He felt neglected, he felt alone. He didn't know how to properly deal with his emotions. I mean, he's a 13-year-old boy.
We can't identify her because her brother, who we're calling Jacob, is still a ward of Nunavut. Jacob returned home this past summer after over 3 years in 2 Ottawa group homes.
He used to phone me up to 5 times a day, every single day. And he would be crying hysterically. He was going through a lot of emotional turmoil.
Jacob suffers from epilepsy and is prone to seizures. Kids would bully him, trying to trigger them.
It was almost on a daily. You know, it was heart-wrenching. He would have a seizure on the phone with me, and I could hear him fall asleep.
According to Nunavut Family Services, they have over 60 kids out of territory and can spend over $9 million a year to do it, with over 80% of that going to group homes, says Director Joanne Henderson-White. Henderson-White said shipping kids south is not the first option, but places like Ottawa have the medical services the kids need.
This is the last resort, and I want to tell you that before we do that, we exhaust every other possibility.
She said they also have an oversight board that reviews each child's case, but something went wrong with Jacob's. His sister said she tried to get custody as far back as 2013 when he was first shipped to Ottawa.
Whoever needed to make a choice was always out of town, or they needed to wait to hear a response from someone else, and then I would just get a random email after a month or two saying, you know, that he's just not ready.
Meanwhile, Jacob was posting comments like these on Facebook.
He also ended up here at the courthouse, charged with assaulting fellow kids and a group home worker. The judge on his case wanted to know more about him. Just how did this little Nook boy end up in Ottawa, and why was he struggling? So he ordered a Gladue report that would explain all that. During interviews for that Gladue report, his longtime social worker made this startling comment. I have never received a call from any of the sisters, or even the stepfather. The aunt had mentioned to me that maybe it would be a good idea if Jacob would one day live with either one of them, but they never called this office or contacted me. The sister says that simply isn't true. The social worker didn't respond to a request for an interview. APTN has nothing to suggest Jacob didn't receive proper care. But Nunavut Family Services said during routine checks of the homes in Ottawa, they've uncovered issues like lack of culture and kids not being able to speak their own language.
Group homes have long been an issue, according to Ontario's child advocate. Erwin Elman said the Ontario government recently wrapped up a review of concerns around group homes and foster care.
They had to design an expert panel and have them travel across the province to decide how dire the problem was in terms of the experience of young people living in these homes.
Some kids told the panel they felt they were being warehoused.
And certainly it was more difficult for First Nations young people who are not only away from their family thousands of miles from home, but away from their culture and their way of life.
Back up in Iqaluit, one city councillor would like to bring the kids home. Terry Dobbin worked as a councillor for 12 years at one group home in Iqaluit.
It was a loving home. It was great. People loved it. The kids interact within the community.
But Nunavut shifted focus of the home in 2012 and shipped the kids south, each with different medical or special needs. Dobbin said he flew with one boy to Ottawa, where he's remained since.
Kid, they weren't even ready for him, and it broke my heart to leave that child there, but I didn't have any other choice because the decision was made to ship all these kids south.
He said the kids faced forced assimilation in the south. That's what happened to Jacob, says his sister. He came to Ottawa barely knowing English and left basically only speaking it.
And it just culturally, where we come from, it's all about family. It's all about support and love and being there for each other.
Sarah tried to be there for her brother, even at a distance, with every painful phone call. Nunavut has no plans to stop sending its kids out of territory, but it say it's going to hire a permanent social worker in Ottawa by the end of the year. A consulting company has been managing these kids all this time on a contract basis, acting as the eyes and ears for children thousands of kilometers from home. Kenneth Jackson, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Innu communities in Labrador are making strides to keep their kids out of the child welfare system. Innu leaders say what's lacking is an understanding of the culture, the history of colonization, and the importance of Innu control over solutions around child welfare issues. Trina Roach has more.
These kids are taking advantage of the new youth center in Sheshie, Labrador. It's more than a place to hang out. The band built the center to offer programs on things like healthy eating and cultural activities.
And outreach work, aftercare, prevention work, all are key things. Because I think what we're trying to do is, and what Innu are saying, is that we don't want to be involved in the in-care system. What we want to do is stay away from that.
The goal is to create a healthy community. The Innu are working with the province to tackle child welfare issues. Panashwe says a true partnership would give the Innu more control.
Even though we're having a conversation, that doesn't mean we're agreeing to each other. And that, you know, when push comes to shove, you can veto my decision.
In a community where there's 50 babies born each year, Panashwe wants to focus on the strengths, family, and culture.
Parenting is not something new to us. We didn't say like 40 years ago we all of a sudden became parents. So, you know, but it's only been in 40 years that we've been dysfunction.
Sheshie was only settled in the 1960s.
Everybody 55 plus was born on the land. We always lived in tents, what we would call them Inuit. What it means to us a home is the land, the culture, the country, the whole community, the grandparents, the parents, the children, the siblings, all in one place. That's what home means to us.
In a community only half a century old, the impacts of colonization have happened at hyperspeed. Addiction, poverty, and a housing crisis are the big reasons why Innu kids make up 19% of the province's kids in care.
I find in the Innu perspective and the white perspective, there's a file now I'm trying to close, help out family, but they're waiting for that family to fail.
Chief Eugene Hart says he's frustrated but still optimistic at signs of progress. 4 new social workers focused on prevention, plans for a transition house to help kids in care reintegrate.
If a child is living somewhere, anywhere in Newfoundland and Labrador or outside, they belong home. They don't belong where they're at now. How was your day?
Pretty good. How's yours?
Good.
And it's personal for Hart. He leaves his work to pop by and see his foster son, Paul Rich, hard at work. Rich is out of care now, he's 18, but still lives with the chief and his family, and he feels lucky to have stayed within the Innu Nation.
Like my culture, I know where I'm from and I know who I am, and I can just ask Dad for information if I wanted.
The province is reviewing its child welfare legislation and says it hopes to reflect Innu culture in the changes coming this fall. Trina Roach, APTN National News, Sheshie, Labrador.
That's all the time we have, but join us again on tomorrow's APTN National News for more perspectives on child welfare. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern and Mountain Time. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night.